this will be a really great traditional white scholarly presentation with these slides where the different lines come in and no flashy, too populistic things. So it will be this kind of presentation that I don't really like to listen to, but hopefully the topic will be interesting enough to keep your attention until the end of it. So the topic is about working time reductions and its practical feasibility, whether we can regulate working time reductions or how can we get to the point where we actually reduce working time. And well, the topic, I obviously don't have to talk too much to you about this, is very much discussed in the post-growth literature because it's a potential win-win strategy. Usually it seems that there are some trade-offs between its economic and environmental benefits, but well-being benefits can often be observed. And that tells it apart from other strategies, which are very often very contradictory to current trends, not working time reduction. Often you see figures like this when you look at how working time has changed over the years, and usually people put something like the end of the 19th century here, which was like a historical outlier when people worked so much more than otherwise than previously or later than that. But if you zoom in and look at the last couple of decades, you can still see some significant reductions in certain countries, and you can see some other trends which are more stable. And obviously, it would be possible to talk a lot about these graphs, what's included, which workers are included, how the different work time values are created. But instead of that, let's just move on and talk a little bit about the practical importance of it. It's probably the most important strategy to escape the productivity trap. I guess you all know this concept. If we constantly increase productivity, then we either reduce total labor input or we have to increase output to keep people employed. If we want to keep people employed, that's again a question. The role of work in future societies is a question. But if we do want that, then this is one of the main strategies. And in 2014, I wrote a paper about this question on the compatibility of environmental goals and full employment, and tried to list the various strategies. And I think that's something that connects very well with Yefim's talk last time, where we had this question of, okay, under which conditions do we have those problems if we don't have economic growth? And well, this is one of the key problems and one of the key solutions to that key problem. So addressing unemployment in the case of low growth or no growth scenarios. But then the question is, what can we know about the measurability of working time? And we have two parts of the project in my Hungarian project that are focused on this. And the first part is about working time definitions and measurement methods used in the literature. But this is not the one that I would like to discuss today. The one that I would like to talk about today is focused on the role of regulation in triggering or in guiding working time reductions. So is it actually possible to regulate and to say from tomorrow the normal work week should be 32 hours, and then what would that do? How would that impact actual working times? And the motivation for this question is that approximately 20 years ago, similar things have been tried in France, and the results were not exactly what they expected before. There's a brilliant paper on this explaining how instead of a reduction of 5 hours, they ended up with approximately with a reduction of 2 hours. And the question is this the same now? So could we expect similar results now, or even worse than that? And how does that depend on the context? So is it different in different countries, depending on the sectoral composition of the economies? So what would happen if we try to regulate working time? And then this is a two-part project. In the first part, we have conducted expert interviews to understand the complexities of this question. And that's the part that I will report on today. And the part that is still ahead of us is the survey, where we will try to estimate the share of people who fall into the various categories that we try to create on the basis of the interviews. So when we discuss working time reduction, obviously the primary effect is that people spend less time in paid work, but that requires a definition of working time, which will be job specific. So the measurability, the practical measurability of working time will be one of the big issues. But that's not the only big issue, because there are secondary effects. So if working time changes, then work intensity may change, then compensation may change, then unpaid work may change. So there are various changes, and whether or not someone supports a working time reduction scheme or wants to participate in one, or whether an employer is resistant to the idea or not, depends on these various effects and the conditions of working time reduction. So usually I put working time reduction in plural just to indicate that there are so many different types of that. And depending on these stances, whether people want it or not, there may be deviations from the optimal measurement results, in the sense that if, for example, an employer really doesn't want it, then it's quite likely that the employer will come up with an accounting trick and say that, well, working time, the definition of working time has changed at our workplace. So from now on, we call this working time, and then they haven't changed anything, but they complied with the regulation. And obviously, a third question is what the effects of measurement per se are. So is it easy or difficult? Is it very intrusive into the work project? How do people feel if their work is measured? Is it a good thing? Do they feel that, okay, I'm getting useful feedback through this measurement? Or do they feel that they are constantly being watched by the employers? And this will determine, or at least have an influence on the willingness to measure working time. And then after all this, the first question is what can be measured? And we came up with three different things. Presence, physical presence can be measured. Labor input can be measured. Labor input may include working time and work intensity. Working time, you may have various definitions. There may be like productive working time. So everything depends on the job, the concrete job, but this can have like there may be big differences between the different definitions in different workplaces, and obviously performance or labor output, in other words, can be measured. And I've put a few examples here just that you can imagine which tool is appropriate to measure which of these things. So if you personally observe everything, then you will be aware of the presence of your employees, what they are doing and what they are getting out of it. But many other measurement tools are used, because this is obviously something that not everybody wants, and not like it may be too costly. Some employers may want it, but it may still be unfeasible because it's just too costly. And then there are very different methods. And these methods range from softwares to cards and personal methods, or simply registering bottlenecks, like looking at a whole production process and finding out where the bottlenecks are, and then identifying the people who may be responsible for those bottlenecks. In several industrial processes, that's a key way to measure performance. And then there are huge complexities. So if we want to understand how these things work in the different sectors, then we have to be aware of the diversity of the world of work. So this is just a list of different occupations from number 652 to number 702, just to show you that these are still like normal occupations, and there are like more than 700 of them. I have taken this from a famous paper. This just illustrates the complexity of the question. And in some cases, those people who are involved in these activities, they leave no trace at all. So it's really difficult to tell whether they were their work input, their labor input was big, or their labor output was big. In other cases, there's a full digital record, so you can just see what they have done. Sometimes the software, they work in sectors where there's a software that directly measures everything. So there's a huge diversity in terms of measurement opportunities. But even within jobs, there are differences, because there are fluctuations over time in the workload. So sometimes people overwork, sometimes people don't work as much as they have on, in their official papers. There's also the question of how so what is the time period for which we try to measure working time, because obviously it will be very difficult to, for example, to reduce daily working hours in certain jobs, where reducing the number of days worked is much easier, because there's like a whole big industrial process that you have to start and that has to run. So these kinds of things complicate measurements. And there's also the question of whether employers want to measure working time. Sometimes it just doesn't happen because people don't want to do it, because they trust their colleagues. They think that's enough. And in other cases, the question is, who's interested in measuring working time? And if the compensation is based on working time, then usually there will be a sort of correct measurement, because if it's not correct, then either the employee or the employer will complain, and that will usually converge to a number that is more or less reliable. Whether this number is the official number of working hours is a big question. In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't, because of tax avoidance, for example. In Hungary, there are many companies that employ people part-time on paper, but employ them full-time in reality. And that is something that we have to calculate with. If compensation is based on output, then it's very difficult in some cases to find any relevance for the official numbers, but it really depends on the question whether there's a relationship between input and output, because in some cases output is what matters, but it is possible to translate that into an approximate number of hours that was required to produce that output. In other cases, it is much more difficult. So in some cases, these numbers will be relevant for both employees and employers. In other cases, they won't be. And then these groups will behave very differently if there's a regulation that changes working hours. Last thing that I would like to mention here is that it is also important whether it's the intrinsic motivation of the employee or some extrinsic motivations that drives working hours. Because, for example, in our case, you can change what we have on the contract, but it will change little in actual working hours, while in other cases it's very different. So in Hungary, we have also observed on the basis, we also observed that there's a difference between the private and the public sector. So in the public sector, performance is much less strictly observed. So people don't want to measure that in many offices. For example, these government offices, employers are much less interested in measuring these values. So there's the numbers that they have on paper may have little to do with their productive working hours, and that's again something that we have to consider when we try to estimate the impacts of potential regulation. And on top of all these, there are these big trends that make measurement difficult in many of the new or like not very old sectors. And well, you can see that all three are coming at a huge pace, and all three make the boundaries between working time and non-working time much softer than they used to be. I don't think that it will be possible to have measurement methods that will address all of these complexities and that will come up with some miracles, and neither do companies. So what do companies respond to this situation? Well, they try to measure what they have to measure, so the data that they need, what they can out of all those things, input, output, presence. They measure whatever they can depending on the situation, and what they can measure without huge negative impacts. And in many cases, this will result in parallel systems. So they will see that, okay, this measurement method is imperfect, so we will have to rely on a number of different indicators. So very often they have different values that will come from different sources. And then what happens when there's a working time regulation on paper? It's a huge question whether they try to reconcile those official numbers with some of their numbers that they collect. It's also important that there are changes over time. So as the world of work changes and as those things change with which people's work can be measured, there will be constant changes, and regulation is not really able to deal with many of these. If you look at the types of jobs, these are not very surprising things. Physical work, in this case, measurability is quite good, and because there's low trust usually in this sector, there is data on how much people work. But these are the guys who are least, for working time reduction, they can least afford it in many cases, if you think about like an uncompensated reduction. While when we go towards the more flexible ones, we see that people are richer and richer. But in their case, direct regulation may be less and less effective. So that means that either we come up with smart apps to at least follow these very swift changes to measure working time better in many, especially service jobs, or it will become like a cultural question and an institutional question instead of a question of regulation, whether actual working hours will decrease. And if we want to do that, we will have these problems, for example, data protection issues, and our answers to these questions will likely have a large impact on the future working time, and through that, on the sustainability of future work. And while we are preparing a survey to try and measure how many people in current Hungary belong to these various categories, and if anyone is interested in that, I'm very happy to share a preliminary version of that survey. So if you want to comment on that, I'm very happy if you do that. And obviously, let's not rely on these guys to work our way into a more sustainable future. Thank you.
So basically, this is just kind of, I've become really interested in democracy and what does that mean for climate action recently, and I've started to explore sort of literature around democracy. But you kind of I'm just getting kind of into this topic, so it's just sharing some initial thoughts with you. But I'd welcome any feedback and pointers to things that I might be missing. So just to start with, what is democracy? It's quite difficult to say. Usually people find it easier to say what democracy isn't. We can tell quite easily what an undemocratic society or community or workplace or whatever, we can tell what that is when we see it. But what does democracy actually look like is a bit complicated. We tend to confuse democracy with certain modern institutions. So, for example, elections, the free press, independent judiciary, peaceful transfer of power, etc. And we have all these things, all these institutions in countries like the UK and the US, but I'm not sure I'd classify them as democracies, as working democracies. So, but you could say that at its core, democracy is very simple. Is that the people have the power, different from an autocracy or a monarchy or any other forms of government. But of course, the reality of democracy is that it's not as simple as that. It's more of an evolving process that has all sorts of tensions, inherent tensions and contradictions. So I just want to run through with you these kind of 8 tensions and contradictions that democracy has. I took these from Astra Taylor's book on Democracy May Not Exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. So what she's trying to say is that democracy is this process, is more of a journey rather than an end point, and that as societies go through this journey, they're trying to balance all these inherent tensions and contradictions. So there's a tension between freedom and equality. In order for people to have the power and to rule themselves, they should be free to make decisions. But they should also, that includes freedom of speech, freedom of association, all of these things. But they should also be equal to rule themselves. So things like one person, one vote, and no barriers to participation. But the reality is that these things are in tension, and particularly in economic terms, but also in terms of in the past, particularly. But the situation is not perfect right now by any means. But also in terms of there's issues with equality in terms of gender, race, ability, age, with indigenous communities, all these things. So, but basically, when it comes to being equal, the economic side of things is quite important. So you could think about economic egalitarianism leading to social equality, which leads to political equality, and therefore that leads to freedom. And you can see kind of that as a way of linking these two things. In terms of conflict and consensus, it's interesting how democracy sometimes is seen as a way of being able to overcome conflict, and how sometimes it's a way of creating consensus. So maybe the way that we can see it is democracies as should be striving to create consensus, but consensus is not always possible. And in that sense, you need to find ways of overcoming that impasse when it comes to making decisions in terms of kind of the practicalities. If there's a point where there is no point of making a consensus, then you have to do something about it. And maybe those mechanisms are the mechanisms that we have right now. For example, votes or majority rule and stuff. However, the mechanisms employed to overcome conflict, sometimes in themselves, were established to maintain the status quo, right? So, for example, I think it was James Madison, one of the founding fathers of the American system. He wanted to avoid conflict, but the conflict that he wanted to avoid was the conflict of basically the unruly masses demanding rights, right? So he created a whole system of winner-take-all elections, and you know, the issues with Senate votes and stuff, in order to avoid conflict. But this conflict was avoiding this conflict was basically to maintain the status quo, which ended up benefiting people who already had property. So I think we need to be wary of, you know, how conflict and consensus is talked about, and, you know, be wary of, you know, the certain conflict being posed as being inherent or impossible to change. Then there's also issues of inclusion and exclusion, and it basically comes down to who are the people, who is the we, and then who gets to vote, who gets to speak. And it's again, this all links to issues of discrimination and these sorts of things. Citizenship is quite a random thing. So are there ways in which we can increase the realm of inclusion? However, again, these tensions come up the other way around sometimes. So, for example, sometimes inclusion can be used as assimilation. So in quite a coercive way, you could say that, you know, I don't know, you know, when colonizers go and then they make kind of indigenous populations become part of the system, that's just including them, but actually that's kind of assimilating them in a quite a coercive way. And then in terms of inclusion and exclusion as well, what about the inclusion of other things that are non-humans? For example, we know that corporations have rights already. What about nature? Is that another way of increasing inclusion? There's also the tension between coercion and choice. So this is related to whether we make our decisions or we are coerced towards them. It relates to law and all of these things. So have we actually signed a social contract, and therefore, you know, this is a choice that we made to be ruled by certain laws, but how much of a choice was that? And this happens not only kind of in terms of social contract, but also in terms of, you know, contracts that we pay with private property, private firms and all of these things. Do we actually have a choice there? But because it's a contractual arrangement, it's seen as a choice, as a free choice. So yeah, that's another tension there. When it comes to spontaneity and structure, it's also interesting how structure and kind of the bureaucratic structures around current democracies can also be quite oppressive. So things like electoral maps and, you know, with gerrymandering and stuff, and political parties and kind of the whole lobbying complex and stuff, and how bureaucracy makes it very difficult for spontaneity to emerge and change to happen. So that's another inherent tension there. When it comes to expertise and mass opinion, I think it's really interesting. I think this relates to the topic of education as emancipation, not as a way of sort of training you could say a differential labor force. And I think we discussed this in one of the tertulias about Sunrise Movement, right? And then, yeah, you've got issues of local and global, in terms of how democracy is practiced, and also in terms of present and future. I think it's a really interesting way of understanding democracy. Now, how do these tensions are expressed, or how are they seen in terms of climate action? So I've got a few ideas here, but it'll be great to see if you agree and if you have more. So, for example, in terms of freedom and equality, we've got things like maintaining kind of current lifestyles versus climate impacts, and whether people who are feeling the climate impacts actually have any sort of freedom at all. When it comes to conflict and consensus, we've got things like climate deniers or delayers versus 80% of the UK population being concerned or very concerned about climate change. Is that a situation where the conflict needs to be resolved somehow, and actually, you know, by other means, and this constant pursuit of consensus is actually holding us back? Inclusion and exclusion is interesting. it's the whole kind of thing, you know, should young people be included in the decision making? What about climate refugees? What about corporations' rights versus nature rights? Coercion and choice, again, individual choices versus direct climate regulation or lock-ins that actually don't allow us to make choices. Spontaneity and structure, how do these already established structures for making climate decisions, how do they actually maintain the status quo or not? What's the place for spontaneity within, for example, the school strikes or other forms of protest? Expertise and mass opinion, I think it's interesting. Is it a matter of educating the public in carbon literacy, or is it a matter of, you know, education as emancipation, kind of much more in the lines of Paulo Freire and others? Local and global is very, these last two, local and global and present and future, those, I think that those are very pertinent tensions in relation to climate. So yeah, this is kind of my current thinking about how these democratic tensions play out specifically in the realm of climate change, climate action. And then just to really quickly move to a more concrete example, because this was all a bit in the clouds. Taking the example of citizen assemblies and juries that have been quite popular recently, and there's all sorts happening at the local and national level. Are they a democratic way of moving climate action forward? How do these processes deal with these tensions? So I just want to kind of talk about just really quickly about those four that I highlighted. So I think citizens assemblies and juries, I'll call them mini publics from now on. They strive toward consensus, which I think is a good thing, trying to move beyond these very kind of contrarian politics. I think that's a strength that they have. When it comes to inclusion and exclusion, I think it's interesting that they try to strive for inclusion in terms of trying to get a broad variety of voices in the room, but I think they're quite exclusionary because of the process itself. It involves a very, very limited number of people. When it comes to spontaneity and structure, I think it's interesting that they are quite tightly structured in themselves. However, I think it's important because they can be a form of spontaneity in a world where politics is so dominated by, you know, lobbying and vested interest and bureaucratic things, that these sorts of processes can be a breath of fresh air for politicians and policymaking. And then when it comes to expertise and mass opinion, it's complicated because I don't see these processes as being very emancipatory for the participants. Sometimes, you know, maybe a very cynic person would say that they you know, the answers that people are going to come up with are already predetermined by the choice of experts that participate and the way questions are framed and all of these things. So I think these processes deal quite interestingly with some of these aspects and maybe have some pitfalls in others. And finally, another way of looking at this, which I'm kind of working on, including some more practical elements like cost and time. So I'm trying to look at this and present it with maybe not so conceptual and abstract language to local authorities. So you'll see kind of the things, some of the things I've touched upon. So I'm trying to do this with different types of participatory processes, rank them according to different elements. So yeah, and I know this ranking still doesn't make sense. I can't have high being both green and red and low. Anyway, so I need to work on the visualization of this. But yeah, that's basically where my thinking is. So I'd really welcome your thoughts on all of this.